In this series, and exclusive to this channel, you'll hear a word-for-word account of what the jury were told after hearing 9 months of evidence during Lucy Letby's original trial. Now, with so much harmful misinformation currently being spread online and in mainstream publications surrounding this case, this series seeks to provide for the first time exactly what transpired in court. That means no ill-informed commentary or any bias, simply the evidence as presented during the trial itself. This video has been made possible by the purchasing of court-approved transcripts, further details of which can be found in the video description box below. What you'll hear next is a detailed summary of the prosecution's case against Lucy Letby. This took place at Manchester Crown Court and was conducted by Nicholas Johnson, KC. I'm going to move on to the case of Child C. It was during the case of Child C that we first heard from Dr. John Gibbs. Dr. Gibbs, who you saw for the first time on Halloween. He started his evidence on Halloween and concluded it the following day on November 1st. On November 1st, he was asked the following couple of questions in cross-examination. Quote, "Do you think he," that's a reference to Child C, "would have been better placed when you look at the whole thing in hindsight now, at a tertiary unit rather than the Countess of Chester?" Dr. Gibbs replied, "That depends what caused his sudden collapse and unexpected death." The next question, "In any event, given his health complications, don't you think he would have been better placed at a tertiary unit?" Dr. Gibbs replied, "No." That exchange encapsulates a theme which has run through the defence of Lucy Letby, and it has been suggested, hasn't it, time and time again, that if a particular child had been in a tertiary unit, then they wouldn't have had a problem. There's been no medical evidence that substantiates that as a proposition, has there? None at all. And as His Lordship directed you last Thursday, the questions or the suggestions are not the evidence. It's the answers that are the evidence. If you conclude, ladies and gentlemen, that there is some actual evidence, some identifiable failure that caused the collapse or the death of a specific child, then no doubt you'll be more than pleased to acquit Lucy Letby in that particular case. We suggest that what's been in very short supply has been specifics. What alleged failure or alleged shortcoming caused the collapse or death of any of these children? We invite you to ask yourselves that question in every single case, just as we asked Lucy Letby. Unfortunately, the evidence has shown in this trial that these children would have been better off anywhere else other than with Lucy Letby. And it may be that that's really what Dr. Gibbs meant when he said in answer to that first question, that depends what caused his sudden collapse and unexpected death. Child C was born on Wednesday, June 10th. Lucy Letby murdered him, we say, on the night shift of the 13th into the 14th. Child C's mum, the mother of Child C's statement, was read to you. The mother of Child C said that the problems were first highlighted at 21 weeks of pregnancy. That was when she realised that Child C was smaller than he was expected to be. The mother of Child C was closely monitored, and at 28 weeks she gave up work. As further problems appeared, the mother of Child C was admitted to the Countess of Chester, where on Wednesday the 10th of June, it was discovered there was an issue with the blood flow to Child C through the umbilical cord. Despite that, Child C was born in good condition at 30 weeks plus 1 day. He was intubated and then extubated very quickly, and he made good progress. Lucy Letby wasn't working on the Thursday or the Friday, and Child C remained on CPAP until Saturday the 13th of June. At that stage, he had a mild subcostal recession, which you'll remember is a medical term for an eventuality that indicates an slightly increased work of breathing. But he was handling well, and most importantly, because here the suggestion being made on behalf of Lucy Letby is that there was an abdominal problem, so most importantly on Saturday the 13th, on the day shift, Child C's tummy was soft and not distended. And you will find evidence of that in Melanie Taylor's note, which she made in the early hours of June 13th. This was day 4 of life, and Child C had no outward sign of abdominal problems after 4 days. You'll remember just pausing and remembering what we dealt with yesterday. Child E met Lucy Letby on day 6 of his life, and that's when he developed abdominal problems, apparently. Well, here we have a child on day 4, no problems, or not until at least he met Lucy Letby. Prior to the events of June 13th into the 14th, something had happened which was noted by Yvonne Griffiths, but which was misplaced in the nursing notes, and you can find it at tile 170. She inserted it after child C had died, and this is important, so I'll show it to you, please. Do you remember, this was mistakenly put into another child's notes, but was found after child C had died, and was therefore inserted after the event, as you can see on June 14th. It concerned events at 18:30 on Friday the 12th of June, which is more than 24 hours before child C collapsed. Yvonne Griffiths had found some bile on the blanket, then aspirated the nasogastric tube of 2 ml of what she described as bile-stained fluid. Just under that part of the note, you'll see something else that we suggest is highly significant. Child C had spent most of the day with his parents on that same afternoon, that is the 12th, quote, kangaroo care most of the afternoon. You now know, although many of you didn't before we started this case, but you now know that that's a very, very good sign. After that event, there were tiny aspirates and the position was static. Child C was not getting any worse. When she gave evidence on the 31st of October last year, Dr. Catherine Davis was asked about this, asked about the bile specifically, and was asked this specific question. When you see bile like that, and taking into account the constellation of other features in this case and all the other information to hand, would you expect a collapse as sudden and as like this in such circumstances? Her reply was, absolutely not. I've seen lots of babies with significant abdominal issues, and even as far as babies who have NEC that have perforated their bowel, so made a hole in their bowel so that air's come out and into their abdomen. They don't behave and they don't die in the way child C died. So that's Dr. Davis. That question and answer followed questioning on behalf of Lucy Letby, which had concentrated on the possibility that child C was developing an abdominal problem. And Dr. Davis dealt with that by saying that her examination showed that child C had a soft tummy. And if there'd been an abdominal issue, she would have expected him to, these are her words, be kind of really sore, and that he would have reacted, whereas he handled well. She referred to the fact that if babies are unwell with abdominal problems, then when they're examined they'll drop their SATs and they'll drop their heart rate, and yet none of that was happening with child C. That's why the fact he was out for kangaroo care on the 12th is so important. By the morning, so Saturday the 13th of June, the day that was to have the night shift on which child C died on, by the following morning, child C's presentation and his improvement were such that he was cleared for 1/2 of 1 meal trophic feeds on the night shift. There is a note relating to that at tile 77 if you want to find it. You'll remember the evidence you heard from several of the doctors, I think, about the fact that these very tiny 1/2 of 1 meal feeds are given to prime the gut to get things moving. Dr. Ogden had noted at 09:30 hours that morning, Dr. Gibbs advised to start the trophic feeds if the bile issue got no worse. Dr. Gibbs told you about that if child C's was a case in which there was an intestinal blockage, then the aspirates would have increased, and that is not what we see. Witness after witness was asked about the aspirates, and each gave more or less the same answer. They were very small, they were a potential concern, but when viewed in the light of the general presentation of child C, they were not a problem. Both Dr. Gibbs and Dr. Bain made it clear that the black colour of tiny aspirates in the single vomit or posset was altered blood. It wasn't bile, because bile is not black. Dr. Gibbs made it clear that the blood came from inflammation in the stomach, which is why he put child C onto the drug ranitidine. For all the efforts made by Lucy Letby to create the impression that child C had a problem with his intestines, you know as a fact from the evidence of Dr. Marnarides that there wasn't a problem with child C's gut. Dr. Marnarides told us that there was, quote, no evidence of infection or of sepsis in the bowel histology. So we say that excludes the possibility of the problem. He said that if there had been a problem, it would have shown up on the slides of the samples taken from the bowel tissue which he examined. Not only that, but there was no pathological evidence of there having been any obstruction in child C's bowel. And whilst child C was on antibiotics, they were not the antibiotics for NEC, and the aspirates never got worse. So this is not a case of NEC. I'll come back to Dr. Marnarides at the end of child C's case. Just going back to the sequence, ladies and gentlemen, Yvonne Griffiths, who had child C on the 12th, described him, child C, as a lively little baby who was at his happiest when he was being held kangaroo style by his parents. Joanne Williams, who had child C on the day shift of Saturday the 13th, described him as, quote, lovely and feisty. She too said that on the day shift, child C was really settled when he was cuddling his parents. Sophie Ellis, who was the designated nurse on the night shift of the 13th into the 14th, the shift on which child C died, also used the same word feisty to describe child C. Much was made of child C's very small size, even for his gestation, but all the treating staff said the same thing. He was doing very well. And as I hinted at earlier, his doing well happens to coincide with the period of 3 days when Lucy Letby wasn't on the unit. But she came in for the night shift of the 13th to the 14th, and within a few hours, child C had collapsed. And after hanging on to life for several hours, he died. As I said earlier, Dr. Gibbs giving evidence on the afternoon of the 31st of October had dealt with the unusual circumstances of child C's collapse, partial recovery, and then death. And at the end of that day's evidence, he said this: I can't think of any natural disease process that would allow a heart to restart later on when you hadn't been able to get that heart to restart with full intensive care and multiple doses of adrenaline and so on. So that suggests, and I can't say any more than that, I don't know what it was, whatever catastrophic event led to his death was reversing or had reversed after we stopped resuscitation. I don't understand that from a natural disease process. All his years of experience, and that's Dr. Gibbs' conclusion. Looking at the overall picture, looking at the trends, the evidence leading up to that fateful night shift from the treating nurses and medical staff tells us that child C needed very little extra oxygen, and his breathing support had progressively reduced from CPAP to Optiflow, and then he was in air. If we could just look at TAR 182, because this is quite a useful reminder for us of precisely what the position was with child C. There you will see that child C came off CPAP at 11 o'clock that morning, the 13th. He was then on nothing at all, but then went on to Optiflow from 1300. During that shift, child C managed 2 periods with no breathing support at all, when he was being cuddled by his mum and dad for a total of over 4 hours. He was not a child who was struggling, was he? His problems didn't get worse, or at least not until Lucy Letby arrived. If anything, they got better. His temperature, his respirations, his heart rate, they were all regular and normal. And I've just reminded you a few minutes ago of what Dr. Catherine Davis said about it. On the morning of the 13th at 9:30, Dr. Ogden and Dr. Gibbs saw child C. I think I've already told you this. Dr. Ogden noted at TAL 77, quote, abdomen soft, not distended, bowel sounds heard. And she told you in evidence bowel sounds heard is a reference to normal bowel sounds. Do you remember that Dr. Bowen later told us that this is evidence that there was no obstruction in the bowel, because in a case of obstruction, either no bowel sounds are heard, or if they are, they're what the medics term tinkling bowel sounds. You probably remember that. It's quite an unusual phrase. By the time of the night shift at 2000 hours, Dr. Gibbs had taken the decision to introduce the trophic feeds, and that happened at 2300 hours, 11 p.m. That's TAL 170. Albeit you'll remember that Sophie Ellis had not noted the fact that she gave that 1/2 of 1 mil to child C. On the night shift which child C died, Lucy Letby was the designated nurse for a child with the initials JE, and you'll remember that JE was in nursery 3. But Nurse B was of the view that JE was more of a concern than child C because JE was having breathing problems. But Lucy Letby was not happy about being in nursery 3. If we go to TAL 147, please, we see here telling her friend and nursery nurse Jennifer Jones Key, quote, I just keep thinking about Monday. So that's a reference back to child A. Feel like I need to be in one to overcome it, but Nurse B said no. Jennifer Jones-Key said that she agreed with Nurse B, and at TAR 149, Lucy Letby said this: "Not the vented baby necessarily. The vented baby in this context is the child MRE. I just feel I need to be in one to get the image out of my head. Mel said the same and Nurse B let her go. She doesn't like the fact that Mel got what she wanted. Being in 3 is eating me up. Eating me up. All I can see is him in 1. So you know, don't you, that we haven't got a population distribution chart for this shift, but the evidence proved, we suggest, that there were 2 children in nursery 1. One was child C and the other was MRE. That text tells you, doesn't it, who it was that Lucy Letby wanted. Not the vented one, not MRE, the other one. And the other one in this context is child C. This is where her jealousies start to play into what's going on. Sophie Ellis was child C's designated nurse. Mel Taylor, as I've just said, was MRE's designated nurse. And there was no reason, therefore, for Lucy Letby to be in nursery 1 doing anybody's meds. But if we go to TAR 161, please, what Lucy Letby was telling Jennifer Jones-Key at this stage was, quote, "Yeah, I've done a couple of meds in 1, I'll be fine." Now, this is one of those many situations where something that Lucy Letby has either said or written down, she seeks to revise or reinterpret for you. We've seen it in some of the interviews that we've dealt with over the last couple of days, and we will see it in the material that we've yet to review. But those are normal English words, aren't they, ladies and gentlemen? I've done a couple of meds in 1. Well, what was she doing in 1? If you look at the neonatal review, and it's lines 38 to 41, I'm not going to ask you to turn it up because it delays us, but it's on the screen there. These tell you that Lucy Letby had co-signed for some meds for HM and EB between 2208 and 2215. That last one is 19 minutes before that text at TAR 161. But that's not doing meds in 1, is it? The idea that I've done some meds in 1 means I went in to fetch some medication and then administer them to a child in a different nursery. We suggest stretches the English language way beyond any sensible interpretation. Sophie Ellis, or if we look at TAR 253, the new girl, as Lucy Letby dismissively referred to her, Melanie Taylor and Nurse B were all questioned on behalf of Lucy Letby, and it was repeatedly insinuated that Sophie Ellis wasn't sufficiently qualified to be looking after child C. Do you remember? 3 witnesses all questioned about Sophie Ellis' qualifications and whether she was up to the mark to be looking after child C. Each of those 3 nurses rejected that suggestion, and no evidence was ever produced to support the suggestion, was it? It's something that we took up with Lucy Letby in cross-examination, and I asked Lucy Letby this question. Sophie Ellis, Melanie Taylor and Nurse B were all asked questions on your behalf on the basis that Sophie Ellis was insufficiently qualified to have been looking after child C. Lucy replied, yes. I said, do you remember that? She replied, yes. I then said, is that your position? And she replied, yes. So does it come to this then? You wanted to be in nursery 1? Yes. Your wish was being frustrated by management? By the shift leader, not by management, but the shift leader, yes. And in your view, the person who had what you wanted, in other words, to be looking after the non-vented baby in nursery 1, wasn't sufficiently qualified for the job. Lucy replied, no, Sophie wasn't, I don't think, in the correct position to care for child C. Then I asked a question I always ask, why? Why is that? And she replied, she was recently qualified, she didn't have the experience or the skills. Which particular skill was she deficient in? Lucy replied, she didn't have experience of premature babies, small babies like child C. But which, you see, one of the questions I asked you several minutes ago was whether there was some sort of deficiency in care that led to child C's death. So I'd like you to explain to us why it is that Sophie Ellis was insufficiently qualified to be doing the job she was doing. And she replied this. I'm not saying Sophie caused anything with child C. I'm just saying she was the least experienced member of staff on that shift. She was in nursery 1, the intensive care room, with another ventilated baby, and she had very little experience with small premature babies like child C that we needed to keep a close observation of. Well, she wasn't looking after the vented baby, was she? It was Mel Taylor. But anyway, the next question. So she had something you wanted? Lucy replied, no. The care of child C, wasn't that what you wanted? Lucy replied, "No, not specifically, no." Well, we've seen it in a text message at the time, haven't we? That is precisely what she wanted. Ask yourselves this question, ladies and gentlemen. What did Sophie Ellis do, or fail to do, that the most senior consultant in that hospital would have done differently? No suggestion was ever made, either to Sophie Ellis or to anyone else. And so why, if there's no evidence to support it, was a suggestion being made to 3 separate nurses? It's the same line of questioning, isn't it? It's like insinuating that Doctors Harkness and J-Ram were lying about seeing discoloration, or their descriptions of fleeting discoloration that was noted and attested to by others whose evidence was accepted. It's trying to create in your minds the impression that there is something seriously wrong with the hospital. It's gaslighting you, isn't it? It's doing to you what Lucy Letby was doing to her colleagues in the Countess of Chester. And when you are considering the eyewitness evidence that puts Lucy Letby in Nursery 1 at that critical point when Child C collapsed, we invite you to take into account the text she was sending at the time, which puts her in there just at that moment. We also invite you to consider the subject matter of some of those texts. TAR 152, sent at 21:59. Quote, "The image of the one you've lost never goes." TAR 167, "I've seen my fair share at the Women's," a reference to Liverpool Women's Hospital. TAR 174, "I lost a baby one day and a few days later was given another dying baby." That's sent at 23:01. TAR 178, sent at 23:09. "Only those who saw him know what image I have in my head." That tells you a number of things, not least Lucy Letby wasn't exactly rushed off her feet on this shift, was she? But we say, given the context of this and the other text I dealt with before, she was in Nursery 1 with death on her mind when she sabotaged Child C. Sophie Ellis said that when she fed Child C that 1/2 of 1 ml of expressed breast milk at about 2300 hours, she left the room. Yet another left the room. Before she fed Child C, please don't forget this, before she fed Child C at 2300 hours, she had aspirated a small amount of green bile. We say that the fact that she aspirated Child C's stomach at 2300 hours tells you that there was nothing in his stomach at that time. Apart from the bile, obviously, she had the bile. There was no air and there was nothing else. Yet, having left the room, within a short period of time, according to Sophie Ellis' evidence, she heard the alarm and returned to the room to see, even if you don't remember it, you know what I'm going to say, Lucy Letby standing over Child C, who said, quote, "He's just had a Braddy and a DSAT." That was in her evidence on October 28th. Within a short time, and while Sophie Ellis was in the room, Child C desaturated again. This was the serious desaturation that led to Child C's death. Melanie Taylor remembered Lucy Letby being there, and she was challenged repeatedly on behalf of Lucy Letby. What she had said to the police in an audio-recorded statement was put to her, but she told you that despite the inconsistencies between what she said then and told you, she remembered Lucy Letby being at the centre of events, particularly because she was, quote, "surprised how cool Lucy Letby was and very calm." That was evidence on October 28th. It was Dr. Catherine Davis who was crash bleeped. She told us that during CPR, when she listened, there was no heart rate, no heart sounds or respirations. This, she told you, was very unusual. What she said exactly was this: "I've been to a number of collapses of neonates over my career, and usually, even with the very smallest, sickest babies, there is some heart rate, but it's a slow heart rate or there's some respiratory effort. But there was nothing in Child C's case at all." This is a replica, isn't it, of what I was reminding you of yesterday in Child M's case on April 9th the following year. The evidence given then by Dr. J-Ram. Dr. Davis went to intubate Child C, and when she looked down his throat, you may not remember, but you know what I'm going to say, his cords were swollen. Even before she put anything into his airway. Think Child N, think of lots of other cases that we'll come to. The swelling could not have been caused by the guidal airway that was used. As Dr. Beach told us, a guidal airway sits far short of the vocal cords. If this finding of swollen vocal cords was just an isolated case, you might say, well, we won't read necessarily too much into that. But we have child E, we have child G, we have child H, and we have child N. Add child C and you have 5 children with this type of finding. And this is the power of coincidence, the power of circumstantial evidence, isn't it? It's not a second-class category of evidence. Someone had put something down child C's throat before Dr. Davis had a look. Who do you think that was? She's sitting in the dock. Dr. Gibbs told us that 1/2 of 1 ml of milk could not have caused child C's respiratory arrest, and that doesn't seem to have been disputed. Dr. Gibbs, joined the efforts to resuscitate child C, and as I said earlier, he couldn't think of any natural disease process that would have produced what was seen in child C. You'll remember he said, quote, "Whatever catastrophic event led to his death was reversing." Resuscitation was stopped, and when on behalf of Lucy Letby he was asked about abdominal obstruction, Dr. Gibbs rejected that as a suggestion because he said that if that was the case, there would have been repeated vomiting, and this is the importance of child C being 4 days old. You heard some poignant evidence relating to the time that child C clung to life from his parents. It was agreed evidence. Child C's father, the father of child C, said, "Once child C was baptized, they stopped trying to resuscitate him. It was during this time that child C started breathing on his own. The mother of child C and I were escorted into a family room. The mother of child C said we held him for hours. Shortly before he passed away, child C was given another dose of morphine by one of the nurses. I can't recall which of the 2 nurses this was. This was about 5:30 on Sunday the 14th. You will remember that that rally or that survival period was, relatively speaking, a long time. Dr. Gibbs had recorded handing child C back to his parents at 00:45, and Dr. Davis recorded child C's time of death at 05:58. So that's just over 5 hours, isn't it? During that time, the privacy of that family was interrupted by a nurse who the father of child C described in his statement as Nurse 3. And he thought that Nurse 3 was Lucy Letby. She wheeled in a ventilated basket to the room and said something to the effect of, "You've said your goodbyes now, do you want to put him in here?" When asked about this in interview, Lucy Letby said she didn't remember the conversation. You'll find that at page 23 of her interview. But you'll remember, of course, that Nurse B told us that Lucy Letby was going in and out of that room while child C was dying. And Nurse B had to tell Lucy Letby to look after J.E. more than once. You will, in that context, remember the excitement and odd behaviour exhibited by Lucy Letby in the aftermath of the death of child P, described by Dr. B. You remember Lucy Letby's remark about being at child I's first bath that her mum child I told you about. What was the attraction of that room at that time to Lucy Letby? Again, if this was an isolated occasion, you might not read too much into it. You might say, well, the parent was in a difficult position. Maybe their perception, maybe they've just got the wrong end of it. But when you have similar occurrences happening at different times involving different people who say in effect the same sort of thing, it is the power of coincidence, isn't it? It is not an innocent coincidence. That's the point. You need, we suggest, to look no further than the tragic aftermath of Lucy Letby's attack on child C to recognise how much she enjoyed what was going on. And after repeated questioning in cross-examination, she could not give a plausible reason, could she, for going into that room whilst neglecting her responsibilities to J.E., who had breathing difficulties. The staff on the unit were all confused by what had happened to child C because he was stable. We know that because of the text Nurse A sent to Lucy Letby at tile 288. It's a series of texts actually, 288 to 303. It starts with Lucy Letby telling Nurse A that child B is in 4. Then tile 289, yea bless her, how are the parents of child A and B? That conversation carries on. Then at 293, talking about child B, there's something odd about that night and the other 3 that went so suddenly. And within that same minute, 21:49, Lucy Letby's reply, what do you mean? This doesn't prove anything in itself, does it? But knowing what you know now, what do you mean, straight back? And then followed again by, odd that we lost 3 in different circumstances. Nurse A, 6 minutes later, I don't know, were they that different? Then ignore me, I'm speculating. Then 298, Lucy Letby. Well, child C was tiny, obviously compromised in utero, gaslighting. Child D, septic. Well, we know child D wasn't septic. It's child A I can't get my head around, said Lucy Letby. Nurse A replied, was she definitely septic? Did the post-mortem confirm? We're going to come to child D in a moment, aren't we? Then this one, 301, talking about the post-mortem. When's child A's? They were talking of doing a joint one for all three, as all close together and similar in being full arrests in babies that were essentially stable. There you are. There you have it. The power of circumstantial evidence. They were all similar, all unexplained, all confusing. And all the responsibility of Lucy Letby. Moving on to the expert evidence. Dr. Evans confirmed what Dr. Gibbs said, that child C's respiratory support had stabilised over several days before his death. He was being weaned down from CPAP to nothing and then back to Optiflow. He wasn't being given supplemental oxygen. Dr. Evans made the point that child C would not have been having skin-to-skin if he'd been unstable from a respiratory point of view. He repeated what in effect Dr. Gibbs had already said, that the aspirates were not of concern in the overall context, and most importantly, they were not increasing. 3 nurses describing child C as feisty was not consistent with child C having a bowel obstruction. He told us about the raised CRP, but that was dealt with in the histology by Dr. Marnarides, which I'll come to in a moment. And he repeated an often repeated mantra in this particular case. That child C's progress was not what one would expect to see in a child who was being overwhelmed by some sort of systemic infection. And in particular, his capacity to keep his saturations high in air, in other words, without any additional oxygen, was not consistent with his pneumonia getting progressively worse. Dr. Evans concluded that the reason for child C's collapse and death was an injection of air into the nasogastric tube. Dr. Evans was criticised, and we accept justifiably criticised, for not having given a cause of death in his report, but then saying it in the witness box, because experts should and must notify any alteration of their opinion in writing. But he returned to the witness box on 14 subsequent occasions, and if anyone was caught by surprise by what he said, there was plenty of opportunity to deal with it. But if you think, ladies and gentlemen, that the way Dr. Evans failed to give advance notice of his opinion in the report has, or even may have had, or caused any unfairness to Lucy Letby, then we encourage you to disregard what he said in this case. Not least because when we get to Dr. Marnarides, we will see that he gave a much more detailed description and reasons for reaching precisely the same conclusion. Dr. Bowen gave evidence on the 1st and 2nd of November. She referred to child C's raised markers for infection, which she told you was consistent with the pneumonia that can be seen on his x-rays. But she reminded you that putting the radiological evidence into context, into the clinical context, child C had been taken off CPAP and put onto Optiflow well before the time that he collapsed. And if you want an easy ready reckoner, I think we've already shown you one actually. This is a different one, I think. It's in tile 121, which is the gas chart. That tells you when child C was on various forms of breathing support. Dr. Bowen said that the typical path of decline with pneumonia was a slow one, with ever-increasing ventilation requirements. As for the build-up of gas on the 12th of June 2015, in other words the day before, and you'll remember she was and other witnesses were asked about this because Lucy Letby was not there on that occasion. Or at least there's no record of her being there, I should say, in the light of some of the other evidence you've heard in this case. Dr. Bowen said that the records were very unclear as to 1, whether child C's stomach was being aspirated at that point, and 2, whether the nasogastric tube had actually been left on free drainage. Dr. Bowen thought if that hadn't been left on free drainage, then the CPAP that child C was receiving at that stage, the previous day, could account for the gas. The other thing that Dr. Bowen pointed out, something I think I've already mentioned, was that Dr. Ogden had said about hearing normal bowel sounds on the morning of the 13th, and that in effect excluded the possibility of there being a bowel obstruction. Dr. Marnarides made a substantial contribution to the evidence in this case. He said there was nothing abnormal about child C's bowel. He said child C did not have a volvulus. The fact that at the post-mortem meconium was seen proves that there was no volvulus. Following a meeting with the clinicians, including experts from the defence, Dr. Marnaridis concluded that child C died with pneumonia rather than from pneumonia, because there was nothing to suggest there was any cellular response to a systemic infection. So putting that into language I can understand, what he was saying was that if a particular infection in a location spreads, then you get a cellular response in other parts of the body, which is identifiable at a post-mortem, and that was absent. And therefore it tells you, that it was not the pneumonia that killed child C. He said that the gas in child C's bowel could not be explained either by an infection, because that was excluded by the histology, or an abnormality of the bowel, or importantly, by post-mortem decomposition. He, quote, confidently excluded, those were his words, post-mortem decomposition. And therefore, Dr. Marnaridis concluded that air must have been injected into the nasogastric tube, causing a splinting of the diaphragm, which in a baby with pneumonia was enough to compromise his breathing and kill him. When it was suggested to Dr. Marnaridis that an explanation for the air in child C's bowel was the fact that he was on CPAP, and I've already told you he'd not been on CPAP for hours before this, what Dr. Marnaridis said was this: I have never in the past 10 years that I've been doing this type of examination come across even a suggestion that CPAP belly would result to the deterioration of a baby, let alone this gastric distension that would be associated with a baby's death. He continued, I could not see that if this was a likely mechanism, this would not have been reported in any pathology paper or review or post-mortem examination or congress that I have been to or a case that I have discussed. That is why I regard the proposed mechanism as unlikely. And that line of questioning on behalf of Lucy Letby, we suggest overlooked a number of important facts. First, child C came off CPAP at 11 o'clock that morning. In other words, a full 12 hours plus before he collapsed. In the interim, he survived without any intrusive breathing support, being cuddled by his parents. Second, he did so well that when the kangaroo care ended, he was put onto Optiflow at 1300 hours, which, as you know, is a much less invasive form of breathing support. Thirdly, and finally, his nasogastric tube. This is the point I made to you before about Sophie Ellis. His nasogastric tube had been aspirated shortly before his collapse, and yet no air was obtained. Dr. Marnaridis referred to massive gastric dilation and ballooning of the stomach. They're his words, not mine. He excluded NEC on pathological grounds. When he was asked why the air didn't just pass into the bowel rather than splinting the diaphragm, he gave us a little lesson in physiology and told us that the opening of the stomach into the bowel was called the pylorus. And when overfilled, the pylorus goes into spasm, which prevents the passage of the air through the pylorus. So just to summarise our position, ladies and gentlemen, before the break, this is a case in which we suggest that Lucy Letby's interviews are very important, and I invite you to look at them with me now, please. You'll find them in the interview bundle number 1. Lucy Letby said her only involvement with child C was with his resuscitation. She told the police that she remembered that child C had not long had his first feed when he had deteriorated. You remember I asked her about how she remembered that, and she said it was in her notes she was given before the interview. She said at page 4 that she was not, or she did not remember being the person who fed him, although she did, if you go back to page 2, remember that Sophie Ellis had been the designated nurse. She claimed at page 3 that she was not the person who discovered child C collapsing. Well, you know what the evidence is on that. Interestingly, at page 5, almost exactly halfway down the page, she said that the rough notes of a resuscitation would be transposed into the medical notes and then disposed of. In that context, you might just want to write child M. Lucy Letby confirmed at page 8 that she had had contact in the family room with the child C family when child C was dying. In the second interview at page 11, she would not accept Sophie Ellis' account of having gone in when child C collapsed and seeing Lucy Letby standing over child C. This is an interesting interview, this one. Page 12. When asked why she would have been in there, She said that perhaps she was checking the resus trolley or getting drugs for her baby or using the computer. Well, we know from the neonatal review that that isn't the explanation. At least getting drugs for her baby isn't the explanation. Query, why would you want to use a computer in a darkened room when there's other computers in the light? And why would you be checking the resus trolley? Page 12. Of the remark attributed to her by Sophie Ellis, quote, he's just dropped his heart rate or SATs, she said, quote, she must have said that because that was what she had seen on the monitor. At page 13, she was asked about the text conversation about seeing a dead baby in a cot space, the conversation she had had with Jennifer Jones-Key on the night. She claimed, unbelievably, that she didn't know what the conversation was about or where she had been when she sent the messages. We say that is incredible. It is not believable, the idea that she didn't know what that was about. When the police suggested it, though, she admitted of the possibility, to use her word, that it was a reference to child A. She also said that she was frustrated as this emerged. She was frustrated when she was texting Jennifer Jones-Key and was looking for a more compassionate response. That's why we suggest she was angry when she murdered child C. Of the text, being in free is eating me up, that's the one at TAR 149, it's page 15 of the interview, she accepted that she was frustrated that she was not in nursery 1. Page 16, she said the fact that she was texting up to 6 minutes before the collapse did not give her any thoughts. And then 16 to 17, she accepted that she was in nursery 1 at the time of the collapse, that she was the only staff member there at the time, and she was feeling frustrated and upset. In the final interview on the 10th of November 2020, she was asked about the blood that I reminded you was seen by Dr. Catherine Davis. It's page 18. She denied that she had inflicted any trauma. At pages 19 to 20, she said that she did not remember getting involved with the child C family after child C's death, when she had her own baby to look after in nursery 3 and when nurse B was telling her to care for her own patient, pages 19 to 20. I don't remember it. Shades of what was to come with child D. With regard to Facebook searches, pages 20 to 21, she said she wasn't sure why she had done it. So, ladies and gentlemen, what does that all give us? What does it all give you? It gives you a case of a baby who did not have an abdominal issue that could have caused his sudden collapse and death. That's Dr. Manarides and the paediatricians. It gives you a collapse and death that is inconsistent with any naturally occurring issue. That's all the medical evidence. It gives you Lucy Letby alone in the nursery when child C collapsed, having just been texting her friend about how angry and frustrated she was. That's her own words in interview. It gives you Lucy Letby making references in her text to a child who, for reasons we have already explained, she had murdered a few days earlier. Lucy Letby started the interview process by lying about where she was and lying about her reasons for being in nursery 1. Child C had massive gastric dilation and ballooning of the stomach, which he had not had when he was fed by Sophie Ellis. In the absence of natural causes, it's obvious what happened, isn't it? Even if you don't take into account any of the other cases. When you put child C's case alongside the others, it's as plain as the nose on your face that Lucy Letby must have injected air down the nasogastric tube into child C's stomach. It was, after all, one of her favourite ways of killing and trying to kill the children in this case. When you add to that the fact that child C's vocal cords were swollen and that his designated nurse was absent from the room at the time, we say you have a constellation of coincidences which together and in combination with other children's collapses and deaths can make you sure that child C did not die from natural causes, and it was Lucy Letby that had murdered him.